As a kid, I imagined what it would be like to experience the full fury of a major hurricane. But Hurricane George blew it off the charts for me. I'm José Garcia, and this is my story of Hurricane George in Puerto Rico on September 21st, 1998. Before Hurricane Maria in 2017, 1998 Hurricane George was the strongest storm I had experienced. To this date, and after chasing several hurricanes, it is still my second most intense hurricane experience. I had turned 13 in July of that year and was on 8th grade at middle school. My interest in hurricanes was already in full steam by that time, but Hurricane George brought reality to what experiencing a direct hit of a major tropical cyclone really was. Hugo in 1989 was my first hurricane, which was arguably still a Category 4 with sustained winds of around 130 to 135 miles per hour when it hit eastern Puerto Rico. However, the eyewall missed my location by only 10 to 15 miles, which meant missing Hugo's strongest winds at my home in my hometown of Gurabo. Despite this, I got to experience a prolonged period of sustained hurricane intensity winds due to the storm's mature wind field, likely peaking at around 90 miles per hour and gusting well into the 100 mile per hour range. Experiencing such a historic hit at only 4 years old, added to the fact that 33 years had passed since the last hurricane landfall in Puerto Rico, was quite a strike of fate for me, instilling the seed of interest in storms at a very young age. Now back to George. George was a classical Cabo Verde hurricane. These are the Atlantic tropical cyclones that form from tropical waves that emerge off Africa near the Cabo Verde Islands and travel generally west toward the Caribbean. George became a tropical depression on September 15, tropical storm during the 16th, and a hurricane on the afternoon of September 17. The hurricane peaked in intensity during the afternoon of September 19. At that time, the storm was located 285 miles east of Guadeloupe in the Leeward Islands and about 600 miles from Puerto Rico. By that time, George was an extreme Category 4 hurricane with sustained winds of about 150 miles per hour, based on Hurricane Hunter aircraft observations. After the fact, the National Hurricane Center brought the peak intensity estimate up slightly to 155 miles per hour, or just under the Category 5 intensity threshold. The Hurricane Hunters also measured a minimum pressure of 937 millibars in the eye. George was truly a Cabo Verde monster, and the islands were in high alert for a threat on the level of Hurricanes Luis and Marilyn of 1995 and comparable to Hugo 9 years earlier. Since its formation, I kept close tracking of George. Back in the late 90s, hurricane tracking for me meant watching the news, which were 4 times a day, except on the weekends, which were only at 5 p.m. and 11 p.m. Newspapers with the previous day's storm information were helpful amidst the scarcity of weekend weather information. As you may imagine, hurricane tracking over the weekends was painful for me and involved the use of my imaginative qualities. In addition to that, I could seldom access the National Hurricane Center website of the 1990s in my sister's computer with dial-up connection from Coquinet, which was a luxury back in the days of government-provided phone and internet service from La Telefónica of Puerto Rico. My last day at school before the storm was on Friday, September 18, which happened to be the 9th anniversary of Hugo's hit. The school librarian at Felipe Rivera Centeno Middle School in Caguas kept a large tracking map on the main wall at the entrance. She let me plot the positions of George as it churned toward the Caribbean. The last plotted position on that map was based on the 11 a.m. advisory from the National Hurricane Center. George was 960 miles east of the Lesser Antilles, with winds up to 100 miles per hour. I dared to plot some guessed forecast points which led George over Guadalupe, then near southeast Puerto Rico. The storm eventually passed over Antigua, but the track verified well, not because of my adolescent forecaster skills, but due to the straightforward track just north of west that the storm followed all the way from Africa under the unimpeded influence of a strong high-pressure system. The tracking map was still in the library wall when the school resumed more than a month after the storm. It was an eerie reminder of the days leading to George. Preparations at home began during the weekend of September 19 and 20, as it became obvious that George would be a major threat. A hurricane watch for Puerto Rico was issued on Saturday afternoon, and the upgrade to warning occurred early on Sunday, which was the day for getting all preparations done. Meanwhile, I was eagerly tracking the now frequent TV information as George had become an extreme Category 4 hurricane, and the National Hurricane Center forecasted it to hit Puerto Rico with 150 mph winds, which was even stronger than Hugo. On Sunday afternoon, the hurricane began a significant weakening trend as it was nearing the Leeward Islands. Northwesterly wind shear combined with a partial eyewall replacement cycle weakened George from a peak of 155 mph on Sunday, September 20 at 2 a.m. to 115 mph at 8 p.m. on the same day. That was a 40 mph loss in just under 18 hours. I was astounded. George made landfall in Antigua just past midnight on Monday, September 21st, as a weakening Category 3 hurricane of 115 mph. Soon after, it hit St. Kitts and Nevis with similar intensity. Further weakening to about 105 mph occurred during that day, as George neared the U.S. Virgin Islands. The eye began to move over St. Croix just after midday, bringing the eastern eyewall over the island after 2 o'clock. Inexplicably, the National Hurricane Center never noted the St. Croix landfall in their preliminary report, nor the Vieques, Puerto Rico landfall that occurred later that afternoon. September 21st began with the classical quietness or calm before the storm. High clouds associated with the cirrus canopy and overcast skies dominated the morning. As I tracked the now Category 2 hurricane, its structure began to reorganize during the day on the 21st. The outflow readjusted westward as the wind shear lessened, the convection increased and became more symmetrical, and the eye showed at times on visible and infrared satellite images. The most impressive changes were observed by the radar, as the storm became an eye candy for us hurricane geeks. This reorganization led George to re-intensify and regain Category 3 of at least 115 mph, and I emphasize on the at least. The reason is, if it weren't for the reports of 110 mph sustained in Fajardo, with higher visual estimates, George would have forever been deemed a Category 2 by the National Hurricane Center, a fate similar than that of Hurricane Marilyn which devastated St. Thomas and Culebra 3 years before. Luckily, the Fajardo observation forced the Hurricane Center to bring George back to Category 3, right at landfall on eastern Puerto Rico. I'll expand on this later. As the day progressed, heavier cloudiness and light rain with light winds from the north-northeast set in. I was expecting more of George. To me, it was underperforming. I had planned for taking some video footage during the storm, especially given an open view to the south from the front windows of my house, which were not covered by plywood or storm shutters. Unfortunately, the camcorder failed at the very moment of truth. Despite this, years later I was able to collect storm footage taken by a neighbor just down the street from my house. Back at home, the weather conditions quickly went downhill after 4 o'clock in the afternoon when the core of steady rain arrived. The Eye of George was beginning to move over Vieques, with the northern eyewall over Culebra and western eyewall approaching the main island of Puerto Rico. We had already lost power at home, probably at 3:30 or 4:30 at the latest. My recollection is that chaos ensued past 5 o'clock in the afternoon, when winds became destructive and hurricane force gusts arrived. The western eyewall was already onshore by then, but not quite where I was. This section of the eyewall arrived after 5:30, with gusts that I estimated to peak in the 110 to 120 mph range. Sustained winds were likely at hurricane force, but certainly not near the 115 mph that were estimated at that point. The western eyewall of George never fully developed and had a pulsating nature that made it less steady in terms of rainfall and winds than what usually occurs in hurricane eyewalls. Despite this, significant tree damage occurred during the intense gusts of the first half. The large mango tree in front of our house suffered much branch losses during those first hurricane blasts. Meanwhile, in the northeastern coastal town of Luquillo, Jim Leonard, the late legendary storm chaser, and also a mentor and dear friend, filmed the full brunt of George right on the beachfront. The northwest eyewall moved onshore his location after 5 p.m., and with much different results than where I was. The eyewall was well developed on this quadrant, and he experienced direct onshore sustained winds of about 115 mph, with gusts that he estimated to be peaking to around 140 mph when the northwest eyewall moved over Luquillo at around 5:30 p.m. Perfect for daytime footage of an intensifying Category 3 hurricane. In my view, Jim Leonard's footage is the best video of Hurricane George in Puerto Rico. During our conversations over the years, Jim consistently ranked George amongst his best 3 or 4 hurricane chases, up there with Hurricane Hugo in Puerto Rico in 1989 and Typhoon Omar in Guam in 1992, both arguably of Category 4 intensity. To rank George so high for a legendary storm chasing career spanning over 50 tropical cyclones is a testament to the magnitude of this cyclone. The link to Jim's YouTube clip is included in this video's description. A couple of miles east of Jim Leonard's location, sustained winds of 96 knots or 110 mph, gusting to 130 mph, were measured at 5:30 p.m. in Fajardo. In addition, estimates of up to 113 mph sustained were also reported there. As mentioned earlier, this observation led the National Hurricane Center to upgrade George to a Category 3 of 115 mph at landfall in Puerto Rico. I am sure that higher winds were present in the east and southeastern eyewall of the hurricane. That is where the strongest convection was located at landfall. The eye made landfall in Humacao near 6 p.m. It would not be crazy to guess that George was possibly near 120 miles per hour at landfall in Puerto Rico. The hurricane was quickly reorganizing during the afternoon of September 21st, with the outflow expanding westward, and very deep convection or high cloud tops exceeding negative 80 degrees Celsius, which is an extreme value, indicating strong thunderstorms. Satellite intensity estimates from SAB and TAFB supported an intensity of about 115 to 120 miles per hour. Moreover, satellite microwave imagery depicted the well-defined structure when the hurricane was inland over Puerto Rico. In fact, the upper-level structure of the hurricane continued to organize as the storm was moving over the island. All of these indicators confirmed that George was on its way to another significant intensification period, which was briefly interrupted by Puerto Rico and later got cancelled altogether by the 10,000-foot mountains of Hispaniola. After the battering of the western eyewall, it was time for me to experience the eye of a hurricane for the first time. Feeling the calm in the middle of a storm cannot be properly depicted by words or video. There's an eeriness that tells you it isn't over yet. Winds really began to die down by 7 o'clock at night. The only significant sound outside was that of power generators around the neighborhood. Darkness was total, as power was out everywhere. There was a brief break in the clouds, in which I saw some dim starlights as I was carefully watching from the front windows. Some neighbors who were outside at that point saw them too. The calm period lasted around 30 to 45 minutes, with conditions beginning to deteriorate past 7:45. Then at around 8 p.m., the eastern eyewall showed up. The second half associated to the onset of the eastern eyewall near 8 o'clock at night was the real deal. No doubt, it was much stronger than the western eyewall at our location. It also came back with surprising speed. The winds rapidly built up from near calm to chaos within a couple of minutes. The ferocity of the winds and the sounds of debris flying, branches breaking, and hell essentially breaking loose is something that cannot be accurately described. That's when the expected becomes overwhelming, as all expectations are blown by the reality of it all. The nearby neighbors' footage also showed frequent lightning in the height of the eyewall, which tends to occur in intensifying hurricanes in the deep tropics. Lightning flashes were also observed by Jim Leonard in Luquillo. Despite the extreme gusts prevalent under these conditions, which I estimate were in the order of 140 to 150 miles per hour, the winds were much steadier than in the first half, likely near the 115 mile per hour threshold based on the damage we experienced, and a measurement of 115 miles per hour by the Calle weather radar at about 10 to 15 miles to my west-southwest. It has to be mentioned that those winds were measured at nearly 3,000 feet of elevation. Keep in mind that my location on the north side of the valley, right on the base of the mountains, likely contributed to some artificial acceleration effects of the southerly winds during the passage of the eastern eyewall. Regarding the extreme winds at my location, some artificial wind acceleration effects were likely. The Gurabo Valley, which is where I grew up, is located in the eastern interior part of the island, and is Puerto Rico's largest inland valley. Despite being surrounded by moderately high hills to its north and west, and large mountains to the southwest and northeast, the east and southeast of the valley is only blocked by generally rolling hills of a couple hundred feet all the way to the coast in Humacao. This enables a relatively unimpeded path for storms coming from the southeast, with local blocking or acceleration effects experienced, depending on the part of the valley and the direction of winds during each hurricane event. For example, during the first half of George, the northerly winds from the western eyewall came generally downwind from the Sierra de Hato Nuevo, peaking at over 1,500 feet only a couple miles north of my house. This caused wind blocking, which led to slower winds and also more gustiness, as opposed to a steady battering. The opposite was true in the second half after the eye passed, when the winds shifted from the southeast and were much stronger and steadier as well. In addition, the winds were piling up against the southern slopes and bases of the mountain, which likely led to some artificial acceleration of winds in my area at that time. It's possible that this was the reason why damage in Gurabo was comparable to that of the coastal towns of Humacao and Naguabo, for example. One thing is clear: inland wind decay in a relatively small island is evidently lesser than in the continent when storms make landfall. Apart from mountain elevations and local acceleration effects, one possible explanation is that in islands like Puerto Rico, most of the circulation of hurricanes remain over water at all times, while in the case of landfall of hurricanes in the continent, half of the storm is already inland by the time that the eye moves onshore. This leaves the island more vulnerable to strong inland winds, especially at elevated locations. Back to the craziness, the eyewall blasted through at 8 o'clock, with the peak extreme conditions occurring between 8 and 9 p.m. Our reinforced concrete house shook amidst the strongest wind gust. Water slipped through the tightly sealed metal sheet Miami-style windows facing south. In fact, water with mud managed to pour inside, showing that the winds were picking up dirt from the ground. We had reinforced the windows with pieces of wood, such as broomsticks, to make sure that the windows wouldn't open mid-storm. Perhaps more incredibly, entire leaves managed to squeeze through these windows, which we struggled to open afterward. What an amazing storm. At 9 o'clock, the eye was just to the east of Ponce, as the storm had wobbled to the southwest, positioning us in the east-northeast quadrant. We couldn't ask for a more direct hit than this. By this time, a gust of 125 miles per hour had been reported well to our west in the mountain town of Naranjito. As George continued to move across Puerto Rico from east to west, we remained deep under very strong winds and heavy rainfall for several more hours. The winds showed a noticeable decrease by around 11 o'clock when the eye was over the southwest portion of the island, right where Category 1 Hurricane Hortense had made landfall with 80-mile-per-hour winds 2 years earlier. Between 11 p.m. and 2 in the morning, we were certainly still experiencing sustained hurricane conditions, with very intense gusts in bursting behavior. During those bursts, metal sheets and other debris could be heard impacting around the house. For the second half, my parents, my sister and nephew, and I sheltered at her bedroom, which was facing north and away from the more exposed south-facing rooms. Facing the winds were the master room and living room, where water was accumulating at a 2-inch depth, causing damage to furniture and paints that were brought down from the walls. Despite the sheltering, there was very much a feeling of danger due to the turbulent manner in which the gusts swirled around the house in virtually every direction at times. Conditions relented past 2 a.m., when the eye was just leaving Puerto Rico near Cabo Rojo, or about 80 miles to my west. Two remarkable wind observations came from the northwest and western towns of Isabela and Rincon, respectively. An unofficial observation of sustained 102 miles per hour with a gust of 164 miles per hour came from Isabela, while on the west coast, sustained offshore winds of 100 miles per hour, gusting to 130 miles per hour, were observed in Rincon. George was still at least an upper Category 2, possibly Category 3 hurricane after more than 6 hours over the island. Back in the east, gusts of over easterly hurricane force could still be felt in Gurabo until around 5 in the morning. Tropical storm conditions were still occurring by daybreak on September 22nd. By noon, George had let down after an unforgettable 18-hour ride. The aftermath of the storm was as overwhelming as the storm itself. The morning of the 22nd, I woke up to the sheer devastation left by the mighty George. The foliated trees, debris, and a predominant landscape of disarray and damage stood out before my eyes. I was stunned by it, despite the obvious expectation of destruction while waiting for the winds to subside in the darkness of the early morning hours of the 22nd. Before and after pictures of our backyard showed the incredible difference in landscape caused by the extreme winds. Pictures from the morning of September 22nd were taken by my next-door neighbors and show our own yard full of downed trees, including a fallen palm tree pointing to the north, showing that the strongest winds were predominantly from the south and southeast during the second half of the storm. My grandmother's house lost all of its team-made garage roof. Part of it had flown off during Hurricane Hugo in 1989, but this time George took care of it all. Only a little frame section was left standing, along with ripped paint out of the leading edges of the concrete sections. A portion of the garage roof fell off near a large almond tree, as evident on the left of this picture. The rest of the roof flew and scattered around the backyard, and some of it probably ended up behind the creek, as we never found that section. The Eastern Eyewall video showed that winds were of such extremity that pieces of tin roofs were flying literally upward in response to the turbulent gusts in the eyewall. Fortunately for us, this effect spared pieces of the roof from hitting the cars beneath. I took plenty of pictures of the damage in eastern Puerto Rico in the weeks following the hit. Locations range from my hometown of Gurabo to the towns of Juncos and Las Piedras and the coastal city of Humacao, where the Eye of George came on shore. I also surveyed damage in the coastal town of Naguabo, where my grandparents on my father's side were from. The devastation along these areas was quite uniform, as the eastern eyewall propagated inland throughout the eastern part of the island. Despite this, coastal damage appeared slightly worse to me, which is to be expected. Some of the most impressive damage was in the University of Puerto Rico in Humacao, where my father taught for decades. The campus is located a mere 5 miles away from the shoreline and at some elevation. Large trees, including tall pines, grace the campus grounds with their beauty and peacefulness, offering an oasis from the heat, and a perfect place to study or rest under the shade. George exerted incredible damage on the campus vegetation. The foliation was almost total, and it took years for the trees to recover their former glory. Damage to infrastructure was extensive as well. Roofs were torn apart or mangled in a way resembling a punch from the heavens. road signs were largely gone, trailers were knocked down, and an overall sense of disarray dominated the landscape after the storm. But what struck me the most was the extent of the tree damage in eastern Puerto Rico. Widespread, snapped branches and defoliated trees were a testimony of the intensity and duration of the extreme winds brought by George. My pictures from 3 weeks after the storm, which was around October 10th, showed how the landscape turned brown as the leaves dried out. This lemon tree was totally defoliated and never fully recovered afterwards. My location during the storm is seen in the background of this picture as well. The front windows were my observation spot during the western eyewall. In the second half, the front of the house was exposed to the extreme winds coming from the south. Palm tree damage is usually a good indicator of extreme winds, and significant palm tree damage was evident in the entire area. The mountain slopes also suffered dearly due to the local wind acceleration effects, especially for south-facing slopes of El Yunque in Gurabo and the Sierra de Atonuevo in Gurabo and Juncos. These two mountain ranges helped to slightly diminish the intensity of the winds in the San Juan metro area, which still got certainly a major hit, but not as devastating as east and southeastern Puerto Rico or the central mountain range towns. George also demonstrated that the first generation of concrete poles to be installed on the island were not up to the task of taking a Category 3 hurricane hit. Damage to the electric system in general caused a total blackout of the island, with some areas taking several months to regain service. At home, it took 14 days for us to get our power back, which led to a long recovery from eastern Puerto Rico's worst hurricane hit since 1989. On a personal level, George confirmed the passion that I feel for hurricanes. This started in 1989 when I was only 4 and Hurricane Hugo hit. The active 1995 hurricane season got me into permanent hurricane tracking at 10 years old, with the major threat of Hurricane Luis and devastating hit of Hurricane Marilyn to Culebra, Puerto Rico. George was until recently the strongest storm that I had personally seen, and is still one of the great weather events of my life.